He's one of the most well-known voices in the psychedelic world and the founder of the third wave, which educated millions on the importance of safe and effective psychedelic experiences. And he works on the intersection of psychedelics, transformation, and professional success. And you can find his work in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and BBC's Work Life. And Paul, in his work, helps leaders, creatives, and pioneers leverage psychedelics for exponential personal growth and professional development. And he views psychedelics as a skill refined through mentorship, courageous exploration, and intentional use. So today we'll be learning how to master the skill that will be crucial in the story of humanity's present, future evolution. Paul, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Floris. And thank you all for joining. I see a few. I'm just looking through the names. Hi, Erica. It's good to see you. I'm glad you're here. Hi, Robin. I think Robin and we just met a couple days ago. We're going to be spending the weekend together with doing some journey work. I recognize Carly as well. So it's good to see a few familiar faces. There will be plenty of time for questions and dialogue. I think I have the floor for about 45 minutes in total. And really the intention is to explore the overlap of microdosing, even psychedelics generally, and creativity. And the reason I would even frame it or contextualize it as psychedelics generally is because I think when it comes to microdosing, we've become a little too attached to it being sub-perceptual, meaning we don't feel it at all. And I strongly believe that we would benefit from a reframe around microdosing, where instead of it being sub-perceptual, it's sub-intoxicating, meaning we can still navigate our everyday reality. We're not intoxicated by the substance, but we may feel it a little bit. And I find that level is what's optimal for creativity, that a true, let's say, microdose, a sub-perceptual dose, is more optimal for focus and attention rather than creativity. And we have to keep in mind that focus and attention is in some ways a different skill set than to think from a creative lens. There can be overlap there, but I really think of these as convergent thinking, which is the focus and the attention, and divergent thinking, which is the ability to zoom out and see how seemingly disparate ideas can come together to form a new cohesive whole. And this is how even third wave came about. I started taking LSD many years ago, 15 years ago at this point in time. And about 5 years into my journeying with LSD, I was living in Budapest as a digital nomad. This was 2015. And I was taking a high dose of LSD with a couple dear friends, Nico and Yuri, in the hills surrounding Budapest. And we were just talking about this sort of emergence of psychedelics in 2015. And we had been the few days prior kind of just going around Budapest and checking out cafes. And a lot of these cafes were what we call third wave coffee. So third wave coffee is this, it's intelligentsia, it's Stumptown, it's all of these cute little artisanal places that, have like a little swan latte on their coffee. This is third wave coffee. First wave was Folgers. Second wave was Peet's originally, and then Starbucks. And the third wave is a much more artisanal approach. And so that's how I came up with the third wave of psychedelics. I was taking acid, I was talking about coffee, and all of a sudden those two seemingly very different ideas came together to form a new thoughtful idea. And that to me speaks the power of psychedelics for creativity. That when we use these with intention, that when we use these within a certain context, they can be incredibly beneficial in facilitating creative breakthroughs. Now, okay, so I don't believe we can see questions in here. I just want to confirm, Floris, if you can write in there. I know we had this last time as well. Can the attendees ask questions? I don't believe they can. I wish you guys could. Or is it only the panelists and hosts? No question.
Yeah, only hosts.
Okay. All right. So where do we go from here, right? Where do we go from here? Let's look at the history of psychedelics for creativity and problem solving. The most well-known and impactful research study that was done on psychedelics for creativity and problem solving, and Erica, you will probably guess what's coming, and many of you may know about this study already, was the 1966 study carried out by Dr. James Fadiman. And Dr. James Fadiman is still alive to this day. He has been a dear mentor of mine. He lives in Menlo Park. And Dr. Fadiman is really known as the godfather or the father of microdosing. In 2011, he published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. He had a chapter in there dedicated to microdosing, and that really helped to kickstart the modern movement around microdosing as a modality. In 1966, however, he was a young psychologist who was supporting research in Palo Alto. And he carried out a study where he took about 30 mid-level professionals in. He asked them if they had been stuck on a problem for longer than 3 months. And if they had, to enter this study and see if this moderate dose of LSD or mescaline could support them in solving the problem. And so he gave them the equivalent of about 100 micrograms of LSD, which is not a microdose. That's a very moderate dose of LSD, or the equivalent in mescaline sulfate, which I believe was 200 milligrams of mescaline sulfate. They started their journeys with an eye mask on, going inwards, and then about halfway through came out and started to work on that problem that they had been stuck on. And about, I believe, 80% of the individuals who entered this research study were able to have a breakthrough understanding about the problem they had been stuck on. And the examples range from architecture to product to business and strategy. It was really sort of a wide, diverse array of people. Now, it wasn't until probably about 10 years ago that we had any context as to why that happens based on the brain. And so let's get into the neurobiology of creativity and what psychedelics do on in the brain. So a lot of the reason that psychedelics are so effective at treating depression, addiction, OCD, anxiety, other forms of mental disease or mental challenge is because a lot of these challenges are related to a constricted network. We could call it. Some people call it the default mode network. Some people call it the salience network. Some people call it the complexity network. There's lots of new names for this network in the brain, but there's something about the brain that is constricted, that is rigid, where energy isn't necessarily flowing through it as it needs to be for presence, equanimity, and creativity. And when we take a psychedelic, what's happening is there's a spaciousness that's opened up. There's a way in which those two hemispheres of the brain can start to communicate better. If we look at a brain under the influence of a high dose of a psychedelic, what we see is that it returns to a childlike state. It returns to a state of being that was very familiar to us when we were 5 or 6. And so, as we all know, creativity is inspired by a sense of playfulness. Creativity is inspired by a sense of experiment, trial and error, attempting new things that may fail. And as we get older, we tend to be less willing to take risks. And to be creative, we have to take risks. That's essential to the process and the art of creativity. And so when we take this high dose of psychedelic, when it starts to connect both hemispheres of the brain, well, how do we leverage and utilize that? Well, we need a set and setting, and we need a context that is supportive of that creative breakthrough, which is why in the 1966 trial that James Fadiman did, he said, bring a problem that you've been stuck on for 3 months. Prepare it beforehand. Have a sense of the questions and inquiry that you want to explore with the aid of the psychedelic as part of this. So what is essential to the efficacy of psychedelics for creativity is that priming. It's that preparation. It's, asking these more difficult questions before we actually go into a psychedelic experience. And then the medicine, the substance, the psychedelic, that opens up these two hemispheres of the brain to better communicate and connect, which can allow us to see reality in a unique and new way. Very exciting and very interesting. Now, why psychedelics now? That's the next thing that I want to get into before we go into what I would consider to be like design aesthetics and stuff like that. Why psychedelics now? 2024. Why are we even having this conversation? Why are we having this conference about design and psychedelics, about research and psychedelics? One, simply because these substances have become destigmatized over the last 10 years. When I started Third Wave in 2015, when I was speaking at conferences early on in Amsterdam and Germany and Switzerland, there was a heavy stigma against psychedelics. People were not well informed. They were not well educated. They found them or thought they were addictive or dangerous or harmful. I was really in the minority of individuals who were openly talking about psychedelics as tools, not only for mental illness, but for creativity, leadership, and performance. And what's changed in the last 10 years is Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which came out in 2018. A lot more research has been published as more investment specifically has come into the space. And COVID-19 opened up a period of time where people needed solutions that really helped their mental health. And so a lot of people turned to microdosing and legal ketamine treatment as a result of that. And so at this point in time, 61% of Americans support legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. The majority of Americans now support legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. That comes from Cal Berkeley, which I spelled incorrectly, but you get my point. 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. The number of individuals who have taken a psychedelic in the last 4 years has quadrupled. Not increased by 30% or not increased by 75% or not even just doubled, has quadrupled. So the number of people who took a psychedelic in 2023, it was 4 times the number of people who had taken a psychedelic in 2019. That is insane and incredible and amazing. And so we're having this conversation at this point in time because the majority of people now support legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. We're having a conversation at this point in time because the number of people who are microdosing, who are working with ketamine, who are working with mushrooms, who are drinking ayahuasca is increasing at a very, very high rate. And so as we get deeper into this third wave of psychedelics, the initial emphasis, and this was true for me as well when I started working with LSD 15 years ago, the initial emphasis for most people is on the healing journey. How do I heal PTSD? How do I heal addiction? How do I heal depression? How do I heal anxiety? You know, for me, I grew up in a very religious family. So I had a lot of guilt and shame from the way that I was raised. And so I had a lot of guilt and shame to heal. But naturally, as we continue on that path and process and journey of healing, and most importantly, unfolding, transforming as humans, we start to ask these bigger questions about not only how can psychedelics help me to heal, but how can psychedelics help me to be more creative, to be more inspired, to be a better communicator, to have healthier relationships? And so we're having this conversation at this point in time because I think we as a culture are ready to talk about not only psychedelics for PTSD, depression, and addiction, but I would argue even more importantly, the sort of influence and the relevance and the efficacy of psychedelics for leadership, creativity, performance, and well-being. So Buckminster Fuller has a phenomenal quote, which I'm going to pull quickly from the internet so I don't butcher it, because I've butchered it too many times in too many contexts. And so you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Our current model is extractive, separated, consumeristic, out of touch, pharmaceutical, big money, oligarchy, corrupt government, right? These are sort of aspects and elements of our current model. And our current model worked for hundreds of years, I would argue. I'm not someone who would say industrialism has only been negative for us. I would say over the last few hundred years, the breakthroughs and the impact that industrialism has had on poverty, on overall health and well-being, on infant mortality is astounding and incredible. And yet, in the last 50 years, we've plateaued. We've hit a ceiling. And so there's been this new model that's been stewarded, this model of the information age, this model of mycelial networks, this model of the internet, and now blockchain and crypto and Bitcoin. This decentralized ecosystem that sees everything as interconnected, that recognizes the importance of regeneration of our environment, and that allows for the individual to really take healing and transformation into their own hands through the Aura Ring, which I found out about through Erica, who I think is on this call, through the Aura Ring, through blood work, through other forms of personalized medicine and healthcare. And so the question that I'm asking, and the question that I think we all should ask, is how can psychedelics inspire a creative new model for business, for politics, for healthcare, for education, for the way we live, that is rooted in this fundamental truth of interconnectedness? That again and again and again, what we hear from people who have worked with high doses of psychedelics is that there is this deep sense of, I am connected to everything around me. And this is especially true if you're taking acid in the woods or mushrooms in the woods, or you're going down to Peru and drinking ayahuasca. The set and setting does matter to a large degree. And so when we have this deep sense of interconnection, we can no longer build and create systems that are responsible for the decimation of our environment, because we come to realize that our health, individually and collectively, is intertwined, is entangled with the health of our ecosystem. And so how do we create new systems that actually place that at the center of everything that we're doing? What are those new models? How do we inform those? There's some examples, like the Waldorf School for Education is fantastic. In healthcare, there's individuals who will, for example, go to the jungle or go into nature for 2 or 3 weeks at a time to heal from stress-related disease and challenges and issues. We see this in business with the triple bottom line. We're not just focused on profit, but we're also focused on purpose and community. There's another P word for that, but I forget what it is. Purpose, profit, and community is what we're looking at, right? So there's examples that are, and we can even look at Tesla and what Elon Musk has built through Tesla, this decentralized energy system. Tesla is not a car company, folks. I mean, they are now. But Tesla is building out an entirely decentralized energy system with solar, with batteries, with AI, with cars, to ensure that we can get off this centralized power grid, which has a lot of risk. There's a lot that could go wrong. The more decentralized we create, the more decentralized systems we create, the more resilient we are as an individual and collective. And that's important to emphasize. Okay, so let's just step back, briefly review what we've covered so far. We've talked about convergent versus divergent thinking, how drugs like nicotine and caffeine, modafinil, Adderall support convergent thinking, getting things done, and how psychedelics support divergent thinking. I talked about the example of third wave. We discussed the early research that Jim Fadiman did on divergent thinking. We've discussed Bucky Fuller's new model, quote about creating new models, and how we need to root those new models in systems change, in changing politics, education, healthcare, rooted in this truth of interconnectedness. Now, what about AI? What about remote work? What about these new forms of organization and technology that will come online in the next 5 to 10 years? How does that influence our conversation around psychedelics and creativity? Well, let's turn the clock back just 15 minutes to when I was talking about convergent and divergent thinking. That over the sort of trajectory of industrialism, The most valuable tool has been the capacity to get things done. Boom, 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 boom. There was an elite ruling class for almost that entire time that told you what to do. Elite ruling class that told you what to do. But the vast majority of our roles, our jobs, was simply to get things done. And stimulants helped with that. And alcohol helped us to unwind after that. We're now reaching a time and place where those getting things done, those tasks, will be increasingly handled by AGI and artificial intelligence. Automation will only continue to increase. And so the question will be, what do we do with this newfound energy? Where do we invest it? How do we utilize it? I just saw an article yesterday on Twitter. For those of you who aren't on Twitter or love Twitter, I'm on there. I regularly post slightly controversial and spicy takes. Some are serious, some are not. And I would encourage you to comment and follow and let me know your thoughts. But I saw an article yesterday about how I think Kentucky government vetoed a bill that would help make it easier for self-driving cars to come on the roads. And the tweet was from Teamsters, the union. And of course, they were excited. They were like, no, this is going to impact middle-class families. This is going to make us lose jobs. This is going to impact public safety. By the way, self-driving cars will be way safer than regular drivers. Most people are, as we've all experienced, terrible drivers. Right? So having self-driving cars is a huge win. The technology still needs to develop a bit more, but we should be there within 3 to 5 years. Tesla actually just unveiled its plan to roll out a robo-taxi by August, which is incredibly exciting. But the point that the Teamsters do have is that it will impact a lot of middle-class families because a lot of people who are truck drivers, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people will potentially lose their job in the next 10 years. This could be true not only for truck drivers, it could also be true for lawyers. Both ends of the spectrum, blue collar and white collar. So if that's the case, what do we do with that new time and energy? Here's my sort of belief and hypothesis and what I would love to see. First of all, we need to create a better system, a better safety net, a better social network. And this is very true for America in particular. There's a fantastic book called The Listening Society, which talks about the concept of meta-modernism. And so I don't want to get too heady on you. I'm probably heady enough as it is. But essentially, it's the model that Scandinavia uses. With the onset of AI and automation, with, at this point, the increasing sort of consolidation of wealth, with the potential for vocation to be something that we really deeply care about. We see this all over. So many people are unhappy with the work that they do. My prayer or my hope is that we can create a system in the United States, in the Western world, that is built off of the model that Scandinavia has made successful, which is people need to be incentivized, they need to be motivated, they need to be inspired to create and build and become entrepreneurs. And equally, there needs to be a social network, a safety net for the least of us, but also for those of us who take risks and fail. And that, again, fingers crossed, within the next 5 to 10 years, we will see something that resembles a universal basic income in the United States. And it will likely be built utilizing cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And that as more of us have our basic physiological needs taken care of, I would argue that a fair number of us already do, maybe anywhere from 5 to 7%. But as that number tips into 10%, that's the key number that we're looking at, because change is not linear, it's exponential. I mean, we don't need a majority of people to have this, but we do need a strong and creative minority. And when we've created that system, the sort of right recipe for about 10% of people to be totally free from worrying about bills and food and where they're going to live. What would it look like if those 10% of people started to put all of their time and energy in creating this regenerative ecosystem? How can we then use psychedelics as a tool at microdoses and high doses to develop an ecosystem that recognizes the value of nature? Because what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and I talked a lot about this in a talk that I gave many years ago at the Next Web. If you just search the Next Web microdosing, you can find the talk. It has just under 500,000 views. I gave this talk in May 2017, so almost 7 years ago now. And what I talked about in that talk is with the onset of remote work, AI, and universal basic income, more and more people will be motivated not by money, but by mission and impact. Not by how do I just take care of me, but how can I actually either start or get behind a mission or a vision that is doing something great for the world. And what role might psychedelics have, microdosing and high dosing, in facilitating the courage, because it really is courage, to make that leap. To make that leap from ego and what I would consider to be superficial incentives to deeply caring about the world around us and learning to live with less. There's a balance. I'm not saying we should get rid of the ego. I'm not saying the ego doesn't have a place. I think one of the greatest aspects and elements of the Western civ, Western culture, has been the development of the egoic self. It's critical and essential. And it's become imbalanced. There's too much of an emphasis on the egoic and individual self. And so the reason psychedelics, I believe, are coming back into the sort of zeitgeist at this point in time is to help us to remember to balance that egoic individual self with the needs, the desires of this greater collective. And what I believe to this day, and what I've seen play out over the last 9 years, is microdosing is that bridge to cultural accessibility. That microdosing is the way that we can start the process. And I know this talk was supposed to be very specific to microdosing for creativity, and so I want to share a little bit about that, because I think it would be helpful context then about what type of microdose and when. So the two most commonly microdosed substances are LSD and psilocybin. LSD is dopamine, psilocybin is serotonin. Think of it that way. LSD is dopamine, psilocybin is serotonin. And I mean, what does that mean, Paul? Well, LSD is better for focus, attention, and motivation. I would argue that it's better for overall cognition and even creativity. And psilocybin is better for presence, contentment, somatic, emotional healing, sort of getting back in touch with our body, attuning to the body to heal and open up sort of stuck or repressed emotions. This is a very generalized lens right now. LSD, dopamine, psilocybin, serotonin. So if you're someone who's interested in a flow state, then a microdose of LSD, mine is usually about 12.5 micrograms. A microdose of LSD can really help with getting in the zone. What matters most if you're interested in microdosing LSD for flow is the environment or the container that you set up prior. Because the key aspects of flow is the task has to be challenging, not too challenging, but challenging. No distractions, meaning you're not clicking out into new tabs. And you need about a 2-hour time block. Those are the three most important things. So it has to be challenging. Stephen Kotler, who's a flow expert, calls it the 4% rule, the flow percent rule, the 4% rule. 2 is no distractions. And 3 is 2-hour time block. And ideally, the day or evening prior, you've queued up a task to do. You've queued up a project or a thing to work on. And that way, in the morning, when you're working on something creative, you take a microdose, maybe meditate for a little bit, and about 30 minutes in, you start on that task. Challenging, no distractions, 2-hour time block. And what I experience, both myself and with clients and folks that I coach, is time and time again, it's incredibly helpful in that flow and creativity process. Psilocybin can be as well, but psilocybin that's partly dependent on the other substances that you stack with psilocybin. So the most common one, as many of you have probably heard of, is the Stamets stack. This is with niacin and lion's mane. And so if you do psilocybin with niacin and lion's mane, it does have a slightly greater effect on focus and neurogenesis. But psilocybin just by itself, I find is much better for emotional and somatic work. And what I mean by that is, just as an example, in 2018, I was living in New York City, struggling with stress and some challenging things. And I started to see a therapist for the first time. And on my first appointment, she was very familiar with psychedelic medicine. She's like, do you want a microdose before you come into these? And I was like, I already did. So at least we're aligned. And so before each one of my therapeutic sessions, I took 200 milligrams of pure psilocybin. And what I found is that within that therapeutic container, and this is sub-intoxicating, so I would consider this to be a microdose, back to our original definition, meaning I lived in Brooklyn at the time, I could get on the subway, I could go up to the Upper West Side, I could navigate it easily, et cetera, et cetera. I noticed that when I microdosed 200 milligrams of pure psilocybin before that session, that it was just way easier to open up repressed emotions. That as a 28-year-old, I was 28 at that time, I really struggled to express anger, to express fear, to express sadness, to express grief. All my emotions sort of felt the same. I couldn't really discern one from the other. And so when I wove in that psilocybin into that therapeutic container, I just started to develop more of a language and an understanding for where things were in my body. And that's partly because I was doing a therapy called NARM, Neuroaffective Relational Modeling. And the crux of NARM, it's somewhat similar to Hakomi, somewhat, not fully, is that as I'm talking about something within the therapeutic process, like my relationship to my mom and, you know, how I was dropped on my head when I was 5, accidentally, but nonetheless, you know, if there's sadness or anger that comes out about that, then what my therapist would say is, well, where do you feel that? Do you feel that in your heart? Do you feel that in your shoulder? Do you feel that in your jaw? Do you feel that in your gut? Where do you feel that? Because the feeling of emotions is often tied to very specific parts of our body. And so I started to develop a language and a context and a map, so to say, for my emotional body. And psilocybin was incredibly helpful in that process. So just to recap, LSD for focus and attention, psilocybin for somatics and emotion. And if you want to use psilocybin for focus and attention, combine it with nootropics or herbs that are very yang. And those would be lion's mane, cordyceps, bacopa, long jack, even the racetam. So one thing that I've experimented with is aniracetam, which is a nootropic, and combine in conjunction with psilocybin. If you're looking for that focus and attention and motivation, but you want to stick with psilocybin, combine it with herbs that are a bit more like focus and attention. These are 4 or 5 great ones to start with. Aniracetam is harder to get, but we do have a microdose now called MM1, and we have a product that has aniracetam in it. Great. And please submit all the questions that you have, folks. I would really love to get a sense of where you're at and what's going on. So the final point that I'll make, you know, we've talked about microdosing. And we talked about high dosing with a research study in 1966. And I think there's also something to be said for what I would call museum dosing, which is a psychedelic amount, usually about 50 micrograms of LSD or about 1 gram of psilocybin mushrooms, which is not a microdose. It's slightly intoxicating, but it's also not a journey dose. You're not going super deep necessarily into other worlds. It's a dose level where I feel really great going for a hike, what we call microdosing. And what I found as a practice, something that is incredibly helpful for creativity as it relates to psychedelics, is combining 50 micrograms of LSD with a 2 to 3 hour hike in the woods. I go into that experience as Jim Fadiman had requested his individuals who entered his experiment. I usually have a problem that I'm stuck on. Could be a minor one, it could be a major one, but I have something that just I can't figure out what a good solution would be. And so I find that 50 micrograms of LSD, a 2 to 3 hour hike in the woods, and then some stream of consciousness journaling is a fantastic way to sort of shake things up and move things around to figure out what a potential solution could be to the problem that I'm confronting. I think that's it. That's sort of the crux of what I wanted to cover as it relates to microdosing and creativity. We went through sort of a context of how do high doses of psychedelics impact the brain? How do we choose a microdose based on our intention? What might the role of psychedelics be both in the individual but also the collective creative process of creating a new model in which we can live? And I think most importantly, how can nature inspire this new creative lens, right? That as we re-engage and reconnect with the natural environment around us, what are the lessons that we can learn from nature? That more and more we are looking at, there was a phrase that I was reading in my book this morning, which I'll show you all because it's very relevant to this conversation. It's written by a Stanford professor. It's called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. Stuart Brand, The Whole Earth Network, and the Rise of Digital Utopianism. And there was a phrase where they talked about how a lot of people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were clearly inspired by the natural environment, and they attempted to bring that in to their everyday life. The exact term I am blanking on, but this is a fantastic book to dive into if you're interested in this overlap of LSD and the tech world. So thank you all for joining. What I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage you to do a couple things. One is we have a free community you can join. That's community.thirdwave.co. You can just sign up. If you even just go to our homepage. It's a free community platform. We host private workshops and events there. We have over 5,000 people who are in that community. If you want to connect, find the others, ask questions, dive into everything, that's a great way to do that. And then we also have a training program for practitioners, and I will link out to that below. That's through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. We start new cohorts at this point every couple months, including a retreat in Costa Rica. And we're training coaches and practitioners in how to master the skill of psychedelics through that training program. And then I'm on Instagram at Twitter at PaulAustin3W. And I would encourage any and all of you, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you just want to get in touch, send me a note and I'd love to connect with you.